War is hell. But what happens to captured soldiers after a battle is sometimes much worse. When they weren't shot immediately as part of take no prisoners policies, the POWs of World War II could be sent to some of the worst places imaginable. In this video, we're going to discuss the absolute worst camps and prisons an unlucky POW could end up in, saving the most horrific for last. Located in what is now picturesque Polish farmland, the Nazi POW camp Stalag 8F, sometimes called Stalag 344, was designated for Polish and Russian POWs. These were two ethnic groups the Nazis considered to be subhuman, and Slavic peoples, in general, were seen as fit only for slave labor by the Nazis. Their treatment as POWs in Stalag 8F reflects this. The POWs waged a constant war of attrition against starvation. This was their biggest killer, as desperately malnourished soldiers were highly prone to disease. The unsanitary and cramped conditions provided a breeding ground for many diseases, the worst being typhus and dysentery. In these conditions, death was everywhere. Of the roughly 200,000 Soviet and Polish POWs who passed through the camp during the war, around 42,000 died. In other words, for every 5 POWs who set foot in the camp, at least one would die. In 1945, when the USSR was taking more ground by the day, the POWs from Stalag 8F began what was later called the Death March. The POWs were forced to walk across Germany, sometimes without shoes and nearly always without food, to escape the tsunami of advancing Soviet troops. Hundreds more died on the Death March, some simply dropping dead where they stood from exhaustion and others freezing to death in their sleep. While less brutal than other camps in this video, the sheer number of deaths at Stalag 8F makes it one of the worst POW camps of the Second World War. Now, we're all aware of Japanese cruelty in World War II, especially toward their prisoners, though one camp was worse than all others. While holding fewer POWs than many other camps, the POW camp Sandakan on the northern edge of Borneo was the site of one of the worst atrocities of the war. In August 1943, between 2,000 and 2,500 British and Australian POWs were detained in Sandakan POW camp and forced to do manual labour. Their job was to turn an impenetrable jungle into an operational military airfield. Conditions were deplorable. Water for the POWs was filthy and often made them sick. The food ration was only a handful of dirty rice per day. Beatings occurred regularly and men died daily. But things only got worse. By mid-1944, the war in the Pacific had turned in the favour of the Allies, and the Japanese were worried about losing access to Borneo's vital oil fields, deploying hundreds of additional troops to reinforce these positions. For the POWs of Sandakan, this was a nightmare, as their meagre food ration virtually disappeared to feed the incoming soldiers. The Allies successfully bombed the airstrip, rendering it unusable, several months later in January 1945. To prevent them escaping into the arms of the Allies, who were expected to land any day, the Japanese marched the camp's British and Aussie POWs to an inland base in waves, leaving roughly every month. Those who were too sick to walk were left at Sandakan to starve. Along the march, POWs were continuously shot for falling behind. By the time the marches had finished, only 38 POWs of the original 2,500 were still alive. Too weak to work, they were all executed. Sandakan was a death sentence for a POW, and the Australian government still regards it as the worst atrocity ever carried out on Australian soldiers in war. Another Nazi death camp, Stalag 6K or Stalag 326, was similar to the first Stalag of this video, except it managed to be even worse. Housing mostly Poles and Russians, but also Italians and French POWs, Stalag 326 was another camp in the broad network of facilities designed to exterminate so-called subhumans through exhaustive work. Camps like Stalag 326 used slave labour to produce many goods critical for the war effort, like weapons and engine parts. This practice was encouraged by German Reich officials, who naturally took a cut of the sizable profits. The POWs of Stalag 326 were also rented out for farm work in the surrounding area, making fat bank for their captors. Mass conscription of men for the military had caused manpower shortages in the Reich, a shortage that POW slave labor was supposed to remedy. Stalag 326 was liberated in 1945 by an American armored unit. They were shocked with the conditions they found, describing a foul, death-like odor around the camp Russian POWs who were completely demoralized. Out of the roughly 200,000 POWs, primarily Russian, who would pass through the camp, 65,000 perished there. There was nearly nowhere worse to be in World War II than on board a Japanese hellship. Mostly smaller freighters that had been hastily converted for human cargo, the Imperial Japanese Navy shipped tens of thousands of captured Allied POWs and Southeast Asian civilians to Japan, China, and other parts of their empire. These POWs were destined to spend the rest of the war as slave laborers and, sometimes, test subjects for demented medical experiments. Life on board an aptly named hellship was unimaginable. Herded into tiny cargo spaces below deck, POWs were crammed so tightly and with so little ventilation that some died from lack of oxygen. Other common causes of death were dehydration, starvation, and the ever-present disease. Dysentery was extremely common, and men were forced to relieve themselves wherever they could, the deck quickly running slick with infectious excrement. The conditions were so hellish, it wasn't uncommon for POWs to go insane. An environment of oppressive humidity, little oxygen, and no water or food broke many men's minds. Desperate and deranged, some POWs would drink urine or slit their veins to open and drink their own blood, and sometimes the blood of others. To round off an experience which the word hellish doesn't do justice, many of these POWs never reached their destinations. The Japanese Navy refused to mark POW transport ships in accordance with the maritime law, meaning that many were torpedoed by Allied submarines and aircraft hunting for Japanese troop ships. One hell ship, the Suez Maru, carried 548 sick POWs from slave labor camps in Malaysia. She began to sink after being torpedoed by an American submarine. Most of the human cargo drowned in the hold, but 250 POWs managed to escape. They swam to another Japanese ship which, after picking up survivors from the Japanese crew, machine-gunned the water, murdering all 250 POWs. Believe it or not, there was a fate worse than even a Japanese hellship. The only entry for the Allies in this video, we have the Soviet Gulags. Whether they were toiling and starving in the jungles of South Asia or the weapons factories of the German Reich, Allied POWs only had to endure captivity for a maximum of 5 years. Axis POWs thrown into the black hole of the Soviet Gulags weren't so lucky. Their war may have been over, but their suffering would go on for 11 more years. To rebuild its occupied territories after the war, the USSR needed a resilient and expendable workforce, which they found in the millions of Axis POWs they had captured during the war. Over 10,000 unlucky POWs, who were mostly Germans and Poles, remained in the hellish gulags until 1953. Another 9,200 had to toil in the gulags until 1956, before being returned home. One of the worst of these gulags was Vorkuta. Located in Arctic Siberia, the inmates of Vorkuta Gulag mined for coal. This horrendous work forced POWs and other prisoners deep underground without proper equipment. Starving, weakened, and working in the near total darkness and choking dust of a coal mine meant accidents were frequent. Inadequate food and medicine meant that disease was also rife, and when it compounded with the blistering cold of an Arctic winter, the death rate soared. The end of Stalin's reign of terror in 1953 saw records of the numbers of POWs and deaths in the gulags mysteriously disappear. Likely burned by Soviet officers looking to hide their crimes from the new regime, many of the Vorkuta camp records also conveniently vanished. We don't know for sure how many POWs were murdered in each camp, but we do know that at least 1.1 million Axis POWs went into Soviet captivity and never returned. From being executed in the jungles of Borneo to working 11 years after the war in a Soviet gulag, we've covered just 5 of the most hellish places an unlucky POW could be sent during the war. The fighting nations of the Second World War had a myriad of ways of extracting information from captured enemy officers. The creativity of these methods was matched only by their barbarity, but a select group of Brits had a different take, choosing to treat captured German officers to the finest luxuries the British high life had to offer. It worked beyond all their wildest hopes. This is the extravagant story of Trent Park and one of the most successful intelligence gathering operations of the entire Second World War. As the Trent Park estate was typically English in that it was initially a royal hunting ground, with ownership passing through the hands of many eccentric landed gentlemen before finally reaching Sir Philip Sassoon. Sir Phil was the archetypical English country gent and had the house remodeled to fit the fashions of the Roaring Twenties. Its gardens were beautifully manicured and a huge staff was on hand to serve England's great and good anything they desired. Gentlemen of renown clamoured for invitations to Trent Park for a spot of golf or afternoon tea. Reportedly, it had an atmosphere of another world, the white-coated footmen serving endless courses of rich but delicious food, the Duke of York coming in from golf, Winston Churchill arguing over the teacups with Irish playwright and activist George Bernard Shaw. In 1939, Sir Phil got a viral infection, but instead of resting, hurtled about in unnecessary gaieties until his body was beyond recovery. He died later that year, and the government requisitioned the illustrious Trent Park estate for the war effort. It ended up in the hands of MI19, the British intelligence branch responsible for POW interrogations. As the Battle of Britain reached a crescendo in August 1940, MI19 were inundated with Luftwaffe POWs. Every day, more German planes crashed into the English countryside and more enemy airmen were seized. It didn't take long for the Brits to notice the German pilots, just like pilots everywhere, couldn't stop talking about flying. Immediately seeing the potential, MI19 had Trent Park bugged with hidden microphones. They then transferred the Luftwaffe pilots from their overcrowded cells into the luxurious mansion. The officers had hit the jackpot, while the enlisted men got sent to prison camps across the Atlantic. Initially, there were 6 German-speaking MI19 officers eavesdropping on the pilots' conversations 24/7. Whenever the POWs spoke, the British listeners would start a gramophone recording from their nearby secret base, the M Room. Only recordings which related to military or political matters were kept, and all personal conversations which didn't have intelligence value were erased. This won't surprise anyone who knows a pilot, but when all those Luftwaffe flyboys were thrown in together, they wouldn't shut up. After some pleasantries, the pilots immediately got to discussing the relative strengths and weaknesses of their respective aircraft. They talked about engine performance, maintenance requirements, armaments, and just about everything else concerning their planes. M-Room probably would have been laughing to themselves if they hadn't been run off their feet trying to translate it all. As soon as this intel was passed on to the Air Ministry, MI19 got a massive budget increase. M-Room was expanded with scores of exiled Germans and Austrians recruited for their language skills. The spooks also worked out the best ways of getting their prisoners to talk. POWs who were more willing to start conversations about military or political matters were designated stool pigeons, a weird British word meaning decoy. Stool pigeons were kept in Trent Park, while other, more cagey prisoners were swiftly sent to other camps. Additionally, MI19 started throwing in wildcards to get the conversation rolling. These wildcards were officers of equal rank, but from different services. U-boat officers were a popular choice, as the pilots were keen to hear their stories from the Battle of the Atlantic. With no knowledge of submarine warfare, the pilots asked a lot of varied questions MI19 were very keen to hear the answers to. As the listeners in M-Room were providing the British planners with a steady stream of high-value intelligence, MI19 decided to up the ante. All the officers below the rank of colonel, aside from a few stool pigeons, were transferred away from the estate. In their place, the Brits put generals. After a brief period of questioning, usually lasting a few days, the highest-ranked German officers were sent to Trent Park. The proud generals rarely gave up anything useful during questioning, but that wasn't the point. The point was to make them think the Brits had tried interrogation, failed, and moved on. None of them ever surmised that Trent Park was bugged. nor that they were being constantly spied on. And why would they? Before the generals arrived, Trent Park had been converted into a POW paradise. Staff had been hired to cook and clean, and the gardens had been manicured to a T. MI19 even provided the generals with a friend of equal status. His name was Lord Aberfeldy, and he had graciously offered his country estate to house only the highest-ranked German officers. He was their welfare officer and made sure the generals had everything they needed for a comfortable stay. As he spoke German, he made an excellent conversation partner and had a great interest in experimental weapons. You're not going to believe this, but Aberfeldy wasn't actually a lord who made sure Germany's top brass had enough shaving cream. He was, in fact, a British spy. The Germans didn't know though. They never put two and two together and took Lord Aberfeldy at face value for the duration of their stay at Trent Park. Compared to the hellish battlefields of Europe and North Africa, Trent Park was practically heaven. The generals arose and had a full English breakfast laid on for them at 8 o'clock. They then had leisure time until lunch, which was a formal sit-down affair. In the afternoon, they were taken on guided walks around the parks and gardens, often by Lord Aberfeldy himself. Dinner was varied and contrasted greatly with the meagre fare a fighting unit was often supplied with. In the evening, the officers would lounge on comfortable sofas by the fire while sharing whiskey and cigars. There was no shortage of leisure activities on offer either. The estate had swimming pools, a painting room, a library of German books looted from the embassy in London, and lovely grounds. British intelligence officers offered English language classes and, on occasion, films were screened. Though there were no escape attempts, the estate was guarded by smartly marching British soldiers who saluted the POW officers. Only one complaint about Trent Park was ever recorded, from General Hans Kramer. Unfortunately, there is no tennis court. All this luxury wasn't cheap, and when Winston Churchill found out that generals had been taken out to lunch at the lavish Simpsons in the Strand restaurant, he was fuming. He ordered the pampering of the generals to be stopped immediately. But pampering the generals was providing MI19 with so much useful information that they kept going. They just forgot to tell Churchill about it. If Churchill had known the critical nature of the intelligence the generals were unknowingly providing, he would have been more than happy to book them a table at his favourite restaurant. On one occasion, General der Panzertruppe Kluel of the Afrika Korps and Oberleutnant Jerzy Homer of U-Boat 353 discussed U-boat battle tactics at length. Oberleutnant Homer was eager to explain to General Kluel how a wolf pack operated, how they attempted to get past Allied countermeasures, and how to best make an attack run. The Admiralty found this information extremely useful. A real stool pigeon, General Kluel could be relied on to get the juiciest conversations flowing. He was so good at directing the conversation towards secret military matters that he almost put Lord Aberfeldy out of a job. The best intelligence he gave up was in March 1943. In a conversation with General der Panzertruppe Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, the two men let vital information about Germany's secret V2 rocket program slip. From the transcript of their conversation, "This rocket business, I saw it once. There's a special testing site. They've got these huge things. They said they would go up to 15 kilometers into the stratosphere. And how do you aim? You can only aim at an area at some central point. You're bound to hit somewhere. It's horrible." But the major there was full of hope. He said, "Wait until next year and the fun will start." It was all very secret. Later in the evening, von Thoma even divulged the location of the rocket building facility, Peenemünde. Bomber Command was speed dialed and the facility was blown to pieces by 596 British heavy bombers as part of Operation Hydra. The Brits lost 40 planes, but it was worth it. V2 rocket manufacturing and launch facilities wouldn't be close to operational for months, and critically, wouldn't be ready to go up by D-Day. The generals didn't just give up a vital intelligence about Germany's top secret weapons program. They also admitted to knowing about atrocities committed by the Wehrmacht forces on the Eastern Front. For some of the officers, this would prove to be their undoing. Some were even convicted at the Nuremberg trials by their loose talk at Trent Park. Loose lips might not sink ships, but they'll get your top secret rocket facility destroyed by 600 odd heavy bombers. Here at the front, we try to present history impartially, and that means looking into parts of history that some would prefer to forget about. In this video, we shine the spotlight on the often forgotten atrocities committed by British, French, and US forces in the Rhine Meadow camps. As the Allied armies advanced into a collapsing Germany, they picked up streams of POWs. Many German soldiers realized the war was over for them and voluntarily laid down their weapons in the months preceding VE Day. When the war in Europe formally ended on May 8th, the Western Allies were inundated with surrendered Axis troops. They were mostly Germans, but Hungarians, Austrians, and other nationalities conscripted by the SS were present too. These POWs were hurriedly squeezed into any camp that had room, including repurposed concentration camps previously run by the Nazis. Allied commanders weren't satisfied with just POWs. They had been listening to Joseph Goebbels' Radio Werwolf. The Nazi propaganda minister had been broadcasting about waging a guerrilla war against the Allies as they advanced into Germany. Goebbels stated, "The enemy will be taken in the rear by fanatical population, which will ceaselessly worry him, tie down strong forces, and allow him no rest or exploitation of any possible success." The Minister of Propaganda was probably a victim of his own lies, as Werwolf units were undersupplied and strategically useless. But the Allies believed him and were worried sick that Nazi-aligned militias would start appearing in areas under their control. Conscription for the Volkssturm in the later years of the war also meant that just about any German man aged between 12 and 70 might have been a combatant. Concerned about having to fight a Nazi guerrilla force and not about to let possible war criminals escape justice, the only solution Eisenhower and his commanders could see was mass internment. They interned just about every military-aged male they found. They also banged up anyone with particularly strong Nazi ties, including women. Though they didn't arrest all Nazi Party members, as there were several million of them. This internment policy drove the number of camp prisoners through the roof. By 1945, the Western Allies had interned over 1.6 million people. The administrative burden of managing such large-scale internment, governing what remained of Germany, and supplying their own troops stretched the Western Allies' logistical network to its limits. Something was gonna give, and a catastrophe was lurking on the horizon. Without the ability to steal all the food from its occupied territories as part of a hunger plan or utilize agricultural slave labor, Germany was headed straight for famine. The war had cost most of its infrastructure, livestock, and agricultural machinery, much of which mysteriously ended up in the Soviet Union. A run of particularly bad weather made matters even worse. In 1945, the average German citizen living in a town could only expect to receive 1,000 calories per day, which is less than half of what the average man needs. As you'd expect, conditions were far worse for those detained in the camps. The camps administered by the British, French, and US forces were all massively overcrowded and critically short of desperately needed resources. For example, the camp near Remagen was designed for 100,000 people, but ended up holding over 184,000. In the words of Colonel Gordon, a US Army medical officer commissioned to report on the situation, the debacle overwhelmed many services of the army. German soldiers surrendered by armies, hundreds of thousands within days. The facilities provided for receiving prisoners of war were wholly insufficient. The enclosures for prisoners of war met their name. They were cages and little more. Overwhelmed Allied administrators quickly lost track of how many camps were in operation, how many people they held, and even where the camps were. This compounded with an already dire supply situation to make matters even worse for the prisoners. Unable to supply them with adequate food, shelter, or clothing, the first thing Eisenhower did was rename the POWs to Disarmed Enemy Forces, or DEFs. The Brits followed suit, designating their POWs as Surrendered Enemy Personnel or SEPs. DEFs and SEPs didn't require the same amount of looking after that the Geneva Convention said POWs needed, so the Allies were free to make their own rules. As soon as they were redesignated, the prisoners had their rations cut back from the Geneva Convention's mandated 2,500 calories to between 1,200 and 1,500. A low-calorie diet like this is fine as an emergency stopgap measure for healthy adults, but was completely inadequate for those detained in the camps. German fighting units were commonly poorly supplied in the final weeks of the war, and as a result, the men were already malnourished. Many others were sick with all manner of common camp diseases such as pneumonia, tuberculosis, and the ever-present dysentery. The Allied wartime blockade severely limited imports, meaning fresh fruit and veg wasn't widely available. Records from the Rhine Meadow camp hospitals suggest that the fresh fruit situation was so bad that patients were admitted with scurvy. Even though they were built close to the River Rhine, the camps often had dire water shortages. Colonel Gordon's report describes, "The amount of water available per man is hopelessly small." This led to major sanitation problems. In one case, the prisoners were forced to drink water contaminated with feces because they had nothing else. On the less extreme end, prisoners had to drink unfiltered river water and water contaminated with fuel. Camp guards also took advantage of their situation. US soldiers were especially well known for bringing their rations to the women's enclosures. In return for something to eat, the women were made to service the GIs. Violent rape was also not uncommon. Most officers chose to look the other way when this happened, with many using the oft-repeated phrase, "Well, their atrocities were much worse anyway." It was noted that mistreatment and rape were far more common among soldiers who hadn't seen combat compared to the veteran units. Make of that what you will. On occasion, locals would try smuggle food, cigarettes, or other supplies to the prisoners. The guards would generally try to scare them off with a few warning shots, but if the smugglers persisted, they were shot dead. Conditions were different, but not much better in the French sector. The internment camp located between Bretzenheim and Bad Kreuznach became known as the Field of Misery due to the lack of shelter. Many Axis soldiers had been captured in their summer clothes and hadn't even received blankets by winter. Reportedly, rains turned the enclosures into a morass and the prisoners into shivering wretches. 740,000 Germans were transferred by US forces through camps such as the Field of Misery to France for use as forced labor. These prisoners were used as a general labor source to rebuild French infrastructure and were initially treated as expendable. Some were even employed in deadly mine clearance duties in the Alsace region. During the height of these programs, the French government estimated that roughly 2,000 forced laborers were being killed in accidents each month. This didn't hamper the rebuilding effort though. After all, the French had fresh memories of German atrocities and still saw them as the enemy. Over time, conditions inside the camps improved. Strengthening supply networks and more resources helped, but perhaps the most important contribution was from the International Red Cross. Red Cross investigators tried to enter the camps multiple times but were continually denied by the guards. Eventually, a few managed to sneak in and reported their findings for the world to see. Back at home, many firmly believed that the Germans were getting what they deserved, and the Red Cross became the only institution working to improve the prisoners' situation. After constantly badgering Allied command, the Red Cross was finally permitted to send aid packages into camps in February 1946. The packages became a critical addition to the food supply and likely contributed heavily to the survival of hundreds, if not thousands, of prisoners. Not stopping there, delegates from the Red Cross fought hard to get better sanitation, water supplies, blankets, shelters, and heating for the Rhine Meadow camp prisoners. Their constant pressure gradually swayed the commanders to improve conditions. Honestly, they're the only heroes in this sad story. The chaos that ensued after the Third Reich collapsed made it extremely difficult to accurately track people's movements. Even worse, the four occupying armies didn't share a common language or ideology, and there was no central authority administering the POWs. We don't know exactly how many people passed through the Rhine Meadow camps or exactly how many died, but we do know the death toll in the US sector could have been as high as 56,000. Accounting for POW deaths in the British and French sectors as well, it may have been higher. The story of the Rhine Meadow camps and what happened to Germany post-war has become extremely politicized, especially by the far right. These pseudo-scholars have accused the Western Allies of murdering several million Germans and even deliberately trying to ethnically cleanse Germans from Germany. This is absurd. The horrors of the Rhine Meadow camps will never come close to the scale of the Holocaust or the Soviet dark times. Other sources claim the Allies did no wrong, and only a few thousand already sick prisoners died. This is equally absurd. What happened in the Rhine Meadow camps was an atrocity, and it deserves to be remembered as such. That was the sad and too often forgotten story of the Rhine Meadow camps, the Western Allies' great shame post-World War II. The Bataan Death Marches, the building of the Burma Railway, and the Hell Ships. The atrocities committed by the Japanese on enemy POWs are infamous. But what about the flip side? What was the fate of the Japanese soldiers captured by the Allies? In this video, we delve into their stories. During the Second World War, Japanese soldiers earned a reputation for never surrendering. Their tenacity and will to keep fighting under hopeless conditions became legendary among Allied troops. The Chinese, Soviet, US, and Commonwealth forces put this down to fanaticism. They believed the regular Japanese soldier was desperate to throw away his life for the emperor. In Japan, this thinking was constantly reinforced. Soldiers were brutalized in training and taught that their lives belonged to the emperor by a government-sponsored indoctrination program. From 1941, each soldier was given a pocket copy of the Senjinkun, the instructions for the battlefield. A passage from this short, simple text reads, "Never live to experience shame as a prisoner. By dying, you will avoid leaving a stain on your honor." This concept wasn't limited to Japanese soldiers. They believed it applied to captured enemy soldiers too. Coupled with brutal Japanese military life, this thinking paved the way for the Japanese army to commit the worst atrocities of the war. However, unthinking loyalty and fear of shame probably weren't the main factors that kept Japanese soldiers from surrendering in large numbers, as other armies did. It's more likely the average Japanese soldier was far more worried about his fate if captured than going against the Senjinkun in his pocket. Japanese soldiers expected to be killed on sight if they surrendered to the Allies, no matter which force. If they were lucky enough to avoid an immediate bullet, they assumed their captors would treat them the same way Japanese units treated POWs, horrendously. Believing they would surely be tortured or killed if they surrendered, Japanese soldiers felt they had no choice but to fight or commit suicide. Similarly, medical officers sometimes killed their own patients for fear of what the Allies might do to them. But the worst part is these fears weren't unfounded. Before May 1944, most Japanese soldiers that surrendered to US forces were shot on sight. Allied soldiers, particularly American soldiers, believed the Japanese to be fanatical and expected every surrender to be a ruse. Earlier in the war, some surrendering Japanese soldiers concealed grenades or knives with which they attacked their captors. One famous example was the Gautage Patrol in the early phase of the Guadalcanal campaign. 25 Marines, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Gautage, were annihilated in an ambush while they attempted to accept a Japanese unit's surrender. A Marine watching from afar recounted, "The idea of taking prisoners was swept from our minds. It was too dangerous." Every surrendering soldier was seen as a potential threat. Additionally, the Allied soldiers' habit of taking battle souvenirs led the Japanese to believe that, if not death, they faced mutilation. Bones, and especially skulls from dead Japanese soldiers, were prized by US forces. In Life magazine, the caption, "Arizona war worker writes her Navy boyfriend a thank you note for the skull he sent her," appeared next to an image of a young woman and a skull. President Roosevelt even caused controversy when he returned a gifted letter opener made from a Japanese soldier's arm bone, calling for its proper burial. In May 1944, US High Command initiated programs to educate their soldiers about the benefits of enemies surrendering instead of fighting to the death. They were fairly successful, and numbers of Japanese POWs grew substantially, though generally speaking, Chinese and Soviet forces continued to take few, if any, prisoners until the end of the war. The Japanese soldiers captured before mid-1944 tended to fit into two groups. The first group, containing the vast majority, comprised Koreans, Taiwanese, Manchurians, and other peoples colonized by Imperial Japan. Often from labor units, these men were far less keen to die for the emperor than homegrown Japanese soldiers. The second group was made up of primarily soldiers that had been severely wounded in battle or knocked unconscious. Left for dead by their comrades, they could not resist capture. Once prisoners had been secured, they were moved to POW camps. The US military didn't feel it had the capability to support POWs in the Pacific, so they outsourced the operation to Australia and New Zealand. In return for extra war material from Lend-Lease deals, the Aussies and Kiwis set up POW camps and provided the guards. This is where most of the Japanese POWs ended up. However, a small number of POWs selected for their intelligence value were brought to specially built camps in the continental United States. After they arrived, the POWs were sent to a medical facility in Tracy, California, where they were fed and screened for tropical diseases. Many suffered from parasitic infections and were in the early or medium stages of starvation. Once pronounced fit in Tracy, POWs were relocated to camps at the nearby Byron Hot Springs and Fort Hunt. These camps were specially provisioned for Japanese POWs. Japanese food appeared on the menu alongside local fare, and the men were encouraged to socialize. Each was assigned his own Japanese-American interrogator with whom he chatted informally for a few hours each day. These interrogators quickly discovered that Japanese POWs could not be forced to divulge secrets in the traditional ways, but had another weakness. The mere suggestion that a POW's family might be notified of his capture was enough to get even the toughest men talking. Confident they weren't going to be killed, the captured soldiers feared shame above all. Good treatment and some hidden microphones loosened enough lips for US military intelligence to get all they needed from the POWs. Many believed they had already turned their back on Japan and were, consequently, more than willing to help. Some even volunteered to fight for the Americans. But for the regular grunts, the guys who didn't know anything useful, things were quite different. One of the largest camps holding Japanese POWs was located in Cowra, New South Wales. In August 1944, 1,104 Japanese POWs were secured in Camp B of No. 12 prison compound. This camp was guarded by militiamen of the 22nd Garrison Battalion. The militia was composed of men otherwise unfit for service. Some were young and had health conditions, but more were old veterans. They were armed with an assortment of Great War era rifles and a few machine guns. Discontent had been building in the camp for some time. Facilities were in accordance with the Geneva Conventions, however, cultural differences and racism between guards and POWs caused serious friction. On August 4th, the militiamen heard the POWs organizing a breakout. To stop it, they planned to move all POWs below Lance Corporal rank to another camp. This accelerated the Japanese plans. At 2 a.m. that night, the prisoners staged a mass breakout. On the sound of a bugle, a mass of prisoners armed with improvised knives and clubs charged the fence and began cutting their way through. Privates Ben Hardy and Ralph Jones manned a Vickers machine gun close to the breakout site and, after warnings, opened fire into the crowd. They gunned down over 100 Japanese soldiers before the mob broke through and charged them. Just before they were overrun, the men pulled the bolt from their weapon and threw it away, rendering it useless. They were then hacked to pieces. 334 prisoners escaped, but all were recaptured within a week of the breakout. Many had chosen to stay behind during the confusion and settle scores, as many Japanese POWs were discovered to have been killed by fellow inmates. Several more committed suicide. All in all, 234 POWs died as a result of the breakout, and a further 108 were wounded. Hardy and Jones were both posthumously awarded the George Cross, the highest Commonwealth award for bravery not under fire. The Cowra breakout was the largest and bloodiest prison escape of the Second World War. when Emperor Hirohito announced that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, millions of soldiers surrendered to the Allies en masse. In Mongolia, Manchuria, and China, 1.8 million soldiers of the Japanese army were captured by the Soviet Union and sent to labor camps. They were gradually repatriated from these eastern gulags, but some continued to toil until 1950, 5 years after the war had ended. There weren't just POW camps, labor camps, concentration camps, and extermination camps in the Second World War. Some camps were set up as preventative measures, or so they say. Basically, a country would intern civilians who they believed might pose a threat to national security. Often, these were civilians whose heritage corresponded with a nation's wartime enemies. In the US, for instance, they interned civilians of Japanese, German, and Italian descent. While the definitions are a little vague and confusing, we're going to refer to said camps as internment camps. The term concentration camp is also applicable, but people generally associate concentration camps with brutality and a high mortality rate, if not outright genocide. In this video, we're going to cover a number of internment camps of the Second World War, which were all over the world. In the United States, as many as 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, around 11,500 people of German ancestry, and just over 1,880 people of Italian ancestry were sent to internment camps throughout the war. These included residents and civilians born overseas and in the US. American Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt had quite a rigid opinion on the matter of the Japanese, stating, "I don't want any of them here. They are a dangerous element. There is no way to determine their loyalty. We must worry about the Japanese all the time until he is wiped off the map." Manzanar Camp in Inyo County, California, housed a little over 11,000 Japanese Americans from March 1942 to November 1945. The internees lived in tar paper barracks with very little privacy and very little protection from the elements. They were constantly covered in dust and had to line up for meals and to use communal toilets and showers. They were enclosed in a perimeter of barbed wire and watchtowers. The children attended a school in the camp, however, and the adults could take up poorly paid camp jobs, such as producing camouflage nets and rubber. Some even raised livestock and cultivated fruits and vegetables. There was also a golf course. Of course, the quality of life varied from camp to camp. The situation in Canada wasn't much different. More than 22,000 Japanese Canadians were relocated and interned during the war, accounting for around 90% of the country's Japanese population. While the Canadian government had some 31,000 Italian Canadians in their sights as potential enemy aliens with fascist connections, only between 600 and 700 were actually sent to internment camps. The largest concentration camp of Italian Canadians were interned at Camp Petawawa Army Base in Ontario, where there were also some German civilians. The camp was composed of 12 barracks, each housing around 60 internees. Watchtowers and 2 barbed wire fences enclosed the camp, and like Manzanar, it functioned as a sort of community with people working various camp jobs. Still, it wasn't easy for the internees and their families. In an interview, Italian-Canadian Chester Capone said that the government took his father away for 2.5 years without telling his family why or when he would be released. His father was also in poor health throughout his internment and could only communicate with the outside world via censored letters. India was still under the British Raj during the Second World War, and Germans, Italians, Austrian, and people of other nationalities who had become British citizens or otherwise travelling through India were interned in the country at a number of camps. One of these camps was the Dehradun Central Internment Camp, where the internees were divided into sections, separating pro-Nazi Germans, anti-Nazi Germans, communist Germans, and Italians from each other. Austrian mountaineer Heinrich Harrer, the bloke who wrote 7 Years in Tibet, actually escaped from the camp alongside a German by the name of Rolf Magener, who described it like this: "The British had a camp for internees outside the town, where the jungle met the inhabited world, on a site which had once been a tea plantation and had partly gone back to jungle. There were rows upon rows of reed-thatched huts, with such low eaves that a murky gloom surrounded them." Imperial Japan maintained hundreds of internment camps throughout the war, many on Japanese home islands, but many in other territories they occupied too. A lot of them were mixed camps, housing POWs and civilians. Some were occupied by civilians alone. Batu Lintan camp in Sarawak on the island of Borneo was one of the former. As you might have come to expect of World War II era Japan, the camp was brutal. Malaysian author Wee Kut Jin summed it up well. The trying conditions tested to the limits of the human struggle for survival. Food shortages, diseases and sickness, death, forced labor, harsh treatment and deplorable living quarters were daily occurrences. Generally, the civilian internees were treated slightly better than the POWs. Some chose to cultivate the land and tend to various jobs, including gathering wood, latrine duties and cooking. Some internees were forced to do labor, working in timber yards and constructing roads and runways. Many of the civilians were Dutch and British, including Catholic priests and Catholic nuns. When the Australian 9th Division liberated the camp in September 1945, they freed 396 male civilians and 237 women and children. The Japanese operated a so-called Civilian Assembly Center in Weifang, China too. This was Waishan internment camp used to intern over 2,200 American, Canadian, British, Australian, Dutch, Belgian and Italian civilians living in China, including 300 children. American theologian Langdon Gilkey was an internee at Waishan. In his words, "We suffered no extreme hardships of limb, stomach or spirit. We were secure and comfortable enough to create a small civilization, but our life was sufficiently close to the margin of survival to reveal the vast difficulties of that task." Similarly, the Germans interned Allied civilians in Internierungslagers or Ilags in Germany and some of the countries they occupied. At Ilag 5, Liebenau, a castle in Württemberg, Germany, the Germans exterminated 700 mental hospital patients to make way for 300 British citizens who'd been living in Poland. In the city of Besançon, there was the Ilag Frontstalag 142. As many as 5,000 people, mostly British women and children, were interned here between 1940 and 1941. Hundreds succumbed to sickness, such as food poisoning and frostbite, throughout this time, after which many were released and some were transferred to Frontstalag 121 in Vosges, France. It was much more hospitable at 121 than 142. The internees had access to a theatre and several tennis courts, for example. There were some North American internees there too. Australia maintained several dozen POW and internment camps throughout the war, interning around 7,000 Australians of Japanese, German and Italian descent. This amounted to over 20% of Australia's Italian population and 98% of the Japanese people in Australia, with a total of 1,140 Japanese interned. Australia also took on around 8,000 internees shipped over by its allies. On the 10th of July 1940, 2,542 enemy aliens left England aboard the passenger ship HMT Danera. 2,036 of these people were anti-Nazi German and Italian civilians, and most of them were Jews. After a less than comfortable voyage, the internees arrived in Australia early in September 1940, and the majority of them were transported to an internment camp in Hay, New South Wales, on the 6th. Over the course of their internment, they established what was in essence a township, complete with its own currency. In December 1941, many of them were reclassified as friendly aliens and released. Around 1,000 of the so-called Danera boys volunteered to fight in the Australian Army, and after the war, around 800 of them chose to build lives in Australia. Among them were scientists, engineers, economists and artists who brought significant value to Australian culture. When studying war history, we tend to focus on the bad things, the drama. While there was a whole lot of suffering and death, it wasn't all bad. Many people still found time for a bit of leisure and a laugh. Looking at POW camps, for instance, there were some pretty atrocious ones, but not every POW camp was hell. Some of them were actually a good time. Some POWs didn't want to leave the countries they were held in. In this video, we're going to keep on the sunny side and explore some of World War II's best POW camps, keeping our focus on the camps in the Allied nations. Canada took on mostly German POWs during the Second World War. The numbers vary, but these men occupied 25 or 26 camps throughout the country, with the camps at Lethbridge and Medicine Hat in Alberta holding up to 12,500 POWs each, accounting for the majority of the 35,000 POWs in Canada. At these camps, the POWs were protected under the 1929 Geneva Convention. Provided good food and shelter, the conditions were often a lot better than they would have been back on the front lines. The POWs had a relative amount of freedom too, pretty much running the camps themselves under the supervision of the Veterans Guards of Canada. The more trustworthy POWs were allowed to leave the camps to work on farms. At Lethbridge, there were 350 men dormitories, massive recreational halls, dining halls, educational huts, and workshops. Many POWs went to work on the nearby sugar beet fields, with 2,200 POWs working the fields by 1945. According to one Doran Degenstein, the son of a Veteran Guard member during the war, my father spoke fondly of this time with the POWs. They respected him. He would leave his rifle on the seat of the truck and would often ask a prisoner to move the truck ahead with his loaded rifle still on the seat. Johann Pfeffel, a German soldier, was sent to Lethbridge after getting captured in North Africa. He requested to do farm work, and after the war, after seeing how bad things were in Germany, he came back to Canada and became a citizen. According to his daughter, Gisela Kellner, around 10% of the POWs did this. The POWs at Lethbridge could also participate in sports such as soccer, tennis, and boxing, as well as musical groups. While more than 425,000 POWs, including some 371,000 Germans, 50,000 Italians, and 3,900 Japanese, were held in the United States by May 1945 in just under 700 camps, camp life wasn't all that different to how it was in Canada. Treated according to the Geneva Convention, they were fed and sheltered well and given plenty to do. POWs could apply for paid labor outside of the camp, gain an education, participate in sports, watch movies, and read books, albeit often movies intended to denazify the Germans and awaken them to the war's atrocities. Many were even granted passes to visit nearby towns and hang out with the locals, notably American women. Camp Algona in Iowa housed around 10,000 POWs, mostly German. They were treated well and filled a labor vacuum left by the local men off fighting the war. According to the curator of the Camp Algona POW Museum, Jerry Yoakum, they realized they had it pretty good. They remembered it as a good, safe place to be. They had good food and a decent place to sleep. And in the words of historian Michael Luick-Thrams, the locals were frightened that the POWs would escape. Once they realized how much money was going to be generated by Camp Algona, that changed. Millions of dollars were generated in economic activity. The men harvested a lot of crops. They became friends with us, of the United States. Even one of the camp's POWs, Alex Funke, spoke highly of it. We were all positively impressed. Nobody could become bored at the camp. Nebraska's Fort Robinson was also highly regarded. Around 12,000 POWs were held in Nebraska throughout the war, and Fort Robinson was one of the state's main base camps. It was built to house 1,000 POWs, but grew to a capacity of around 3,000. According to POW Hans Vaker, our treatment was excellent. Many POWs complained about being POWs, no girlfriends, no contact with family, but the food was excellent and clothing adequate. After the war was over and after repatriation, Baker returned to the US and became a doctor. Nearly 400 POW camps were set up throughout Britain to house over 400,000 German, Italian, and Ukrainian POWs during the war. Some POWs were allowed to work as laborers, mostly in agriculture, but after Germany's surrender, all the POWs, except the officers, had to work. Most of the POWs remained POWs for a couple of years after the war. After they were let go, some 25,000 German POWs chose to stay and make lives in Britain. Camp Eden in North Yorkshire is one of the most well-reserved POW camps and a war museum, able to house some 1,200 POWs back in the day. The first 250 Italian POWs transported to the camp built it into a far larger camp comprising 45 huts. The POWs worked on nearby farms and crafted things they were able to sell to the locals. They even participated in dances in the town. According to a BBC News article by Duncan Leatherdale, one of the locals said, "The Italian POWs spend most of their time singing, posing and trying to catch the eye of any female, while the Germans proved more hard-working and reliable than their Latin counterparts." According to the museum's archivist, Johnny Pye, the POWs became well-known and a part of the community and came to be seen as people just like us. They would make toys for the children that they had befriended on local farms, and they would make items to trade as well. While we've covered Trent Park in a previous video, it's worth another mention because it's gold. Located in Cockfosters, London, Trent Park was a country house that housed captured German officers. The POWs were treated to a life of luxury, supplied with good food and better whiskey, and allowed to roam the verdant grounds. The catch? The house was bugged, and MI19 listened in to gather vital intel they might not have gained through more traditional means of interrogation. According to POW Kurt Konker, our involuntary hosts are thoroughly gentlemanlike. The next two POW camps get bad raps because of a couple of unfortunate incidents that occurred at them, but ignoring these incidents, the conditions of the camp were far from atrocious. Around 8,000 people were sent to camps in Australia during the Second World War, with this figure including POWs and civilians sent there from Britain. Over 1,100 Japanese POWs were housed at Camp B of Cowra POW campsite in New South Wales. On the 5th of August 1944, the POWs staged a breakout in which 231 of them were killed, 108 were wounded, and 359 escaped. Of the escapees, many committed suicide or were killed by fellow POWs, and the survivors were all rounded up within a matter of 10 days. You might think they tried to escape because of mistreatment, but this doesn't seem to have been the case. According to the National Archives of Australia, a September 1944 inquiry into the conditions confirmed that the camp was run in accordance with the standards of the Geneva Convention, and that none of the POWs complained about the conditions of the camp prior to the incident. According to the Australian Prime Minister at the time, the attack was characterised by a suicidal disregard for life. It's unclear how many POWs were held by Australia's neighbour, New Zealand, in total, but around 900 Japanese and Koreans were held in Featherston POW camp on the North Island during the war. The US asked New Zealand to set up the camp in September 1942 and take on Japanese and Korean POWs from the Guadalcanal campaign. Of the 900 POWs, 240 were Japanese and the rest were Koreans from forced labour units. On the 25th of February 1943, 240 Japanese POWs refused to work and kicked up a bit of a fuss. In the chaos, a Japanese officer was shot but not killed. The POWs then charged and the camp guards opened fire. 48 POWs died and a further 70 were wounded. Like Cowra, the camp was run in accordance with the 1929 Geneva Convention, which didn't rule out compulsory labour. The POWs lived in huts and were allowed to cultivate their own gardens. They played sports and games, like mahjong, watched movies, and put on traditional Japanese plays. They even carved works of art and used them to trade with the guards. According to historian Richard Bullen, the POWs made their own tools out of bits of wire and nails, and from them they carved objects. A way a lot of these objects came out of the prison is they were made and then exchanged with the camp guards for cigarettes. According to a master's thesis by Meisei University student Yashiro Ota, Japanese prisoners of war were interned at Featherston, New Zealand, and in Cowra, Australia during the Asia-Pacific War. Because of cultural misunderstandings of military traditions, there were violent incidents between prisoners and guards. They had no objection to the living conditions of the camps. They were just seeing opportunities to die with honor. Few fates were more horrifying than imprisonment in a Soviet Gulag. Sent to labor camps in the farthest reaches of civilization, Gulag prisoners provided the slave labor that fueled the USSR's rapid industrial growth. In this video, we tell the stories of 4 of the worst Gulag camps in the Soviet Union. Once Joseph Stalin, one of history's most brutal tyrants, seized power over the fledgling Soviet Union, prisons rapidly filled up. Stalin's paranoia regarding so-called counter-revolutionaries knew no bounds, and decades-long sentences were handed out for the most minor infractions. But there was a method in this madness. Stalin and his henchmen needed a workforce to extract raw materials and start building the immense construction projects detailed in their 5-year plan. Camps were either centered around the extraction of a specific raw material, such as lumber, minerals, or fuel, or served to house construction workers while they worked on a major project. Many small and large camps were run by regional administrators, and they, in turn, reported to the Central Committee. This committee set production quotas and was known as Gulag, while the regional administrators were named after settlements. Centralized management often meant those setting production quotas were severely out of touch with camp conditions. It didn't matter if the coal miners at Vorkuta were already working 16 hours a day. If the Central Committee demanded more coal, they would get more coal. This committee also had an approved mortality rate for prisoners. If mortality fell below that rate, inspectors would be sent to the camp to determine if the guards were going too easy on the prisoners. If mortality rates rose too high, they just sent more prisoners. As long as quotas were being filled, they didn't care what went on. With management like this, camp administrators had free rein to exploit their prisoners for all they were worth. From 1925, the prisoner barracks at Solovetsky Special Prison Camp began filling with political prisoners, ex-White Army officers, Kronstadt sailors, and aristocrats from the Tsar's regime. The camp was spread over several islands in the ice-blocked White Sea just below the Arctic Circle. Here, prisoners worked as slave laborers, chopping wood without breaks, all day, every day. Life was almost unbearable for Solovetsky's 6,000-odd prisoners. In a small camp on the island of Anza, a group of prisoners chopped off each other's hands and feet just to get a chance at a few days' rest in hospital. Camp administrator Potapov found this amusing and, after shooting the offending prisoners, kept their severed body parts in a pile outside his office. He called them his pearls and showed them to visiting secret police officers and new prisoners. Even the environment of the camps slowly sapped the prisoners of their strength. The writer and political prisoner Oleg Volkov described laying on his bed, which was just a wooden board, and having bedbugs fall onto him, one after another, like ants. Not able to sleep, Volkov went outside, where he was enveloped by clouds of mosquitoes. He later wrote, "I gazed with envy at those who slept soundly, covered in parasites." Klinger, a White Army officer, described the punishment where a guard would strip a prisoner, then leave them tied to a post near a pond in the woods. Within a day, the prisoner would be unconscious from pain and blood loss, fed on continuously by thousands of mosquitoes. Far from the White Sea, in the Russian Far East, was another labor camp from hell. The Kolyma region's camps, centered around the settlement of Magadan, became synonymous in the Soviet Union with an exhausting, agonizing death. To reach Kolyma from the prisons in Russia's west, prisoners first had to take a train across the whole of Siberia. They were packed into cattle cars which were stifling in the summer and frigid in the winter. Elderly and physically weak people often died while crammed into these trains, and their bodies were sometimes left alongside the living prisoners for hours. Once the train made one of its periodic stops, guards would check each other for corpses and toss them into the wilderness to be eaten by scavengers. After debarking the train, prisoners were herded onto ships to take them to Magadan, a small city built entirely on slave labor. Conditions were no better on the ships, and this voyage usually claimed more lives. In Magadan's first year, only 9,928 of the initial 16,000 prisoners made it to the camp alive. Even though they were technically on the mainland, camp residents saw themselves as part of an island chain or archipelago. The famous dissident, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, coined the term Gulag Archipelago when describing his time around Magadan. In his account detailing the horrors of camps, he quotes Camp Commandant Naftali Frenkel. Frenkel, one of the masterminds behind the Solovetsky camp, stated, "We have to squeeze everything out of a prisoner in the first 3 months. After that, we don't need him anymore." After those 3 months, these prisoners were called goners. Drained of energy, motivation, and hope, these men and women weren't expected to survive much longer. Tragically, deliberate policies of starvation and overwork weren't limited to the Kolyma camps in the Far East. They were common through the Arctic and subarctic camps of northern Russia. One of the most infamous of these is the Gulag, the camp next to the city of Vorkuta. Vorkuta was established in 1932 as a mining base to extract coal from the immense Pechora coal basin. Unfortunately for the prisoners, it was located 160 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle, where conditions were atrocious. Aside from back-breaking forced labor in the mine shafts, the prisoners had gangs to contend with. The Gulag administrators used Vorkuta as a dumping ground, sending away their most hardened professional criminals to toil in the Arctic coal mines. These men were thrown in with Wehrmacht POWs and political prisoners whose only crime might have been their ethnicity. In Vorkuta, as in many of the other camps, the guards and professional criminals joined forces to keep the 70,000 prisoners in line. Mafia enforcers and organized crime bosses received extra supplies from the guards in return for their cooperation. This system fell apart in 1953 when forced laborers threw down their tools and refused to work. The strike spread to other camps and eventually 15,000 prisoners rose up in rebellion against the guards. Camp Commandant Derevyanko put down the strike in brutal Soviet style by ordering his soldiers to shoot at the prisoners until they went back to work. Estimates vary, but it's likely that at least 53 were killed by the trigger-happy guards. Another of the infamous Kolyma camps was Sevostlag. Centered around rich gold and tin mines, prisoners in Sevostlag spent most of their time underground, tunneling their way into the bedrock of the Russian Far East. Sevostlag was technically not part of the Gulag system, as it was run by a committee set up to develop the Soviet Union's eastern fringes. But like many of the great projects of the Soviet Union, the foundations were laid by people forced to endure the worst conditions imaginable. The slave miners locked in Sevostlag mined gold so Stalin could buy materials from Europe. They were the lucky ones. The unlucky prisoners worked on the Kolyma Highway, now Russian Federal Highway R504. But this highway has another name, the Road of Bones. The Road of Bones is built over permafrost, meaning digging is extremely difficult. The Sevostlag prisoners who were forced to build it weren't provided with tools beyond shovels and picks, but they had construction quotas to meet, so the guards kept them working around the clock. Prisoners slept out in the snow and ate nothing but thin soup while working on the construction. Under these conditions, the death rate soared. Between 250,000 and 1 million people are estimated to have died during the construction of the Kolyma Highway. With the earth too frozen to bury their bodies, the dead were interred in the road. If you drive the length of the road, know that the whole thing, all 2,000 kilometers of it, was laid, quite literally, on a foundation of corpses. Those were 4 of the worst Gulag camps the Soviet Union ever constructed. I woke up in a German hospital with the German nurses working on me, and I knew I wasn't dead because angels don't speak German. This is what an American parachutist nicknamed Jumpin' Joe said later in life, recalling an experience he had during the Second World War after the Gestapo hospitalized him through torture. It's a great quote from a great story, a story of perseverance and humanity in the face of untold horror. A story we're going to share with you now. It begins with the birth of our protagonist, Joseph R. Byerly, in the city of Muskegon, Michigan in 1923. Byerly's parents, funnily enough, were of German origin and had moved to the States before the turn of the century. Unfortunately for them, they had to raise their son during the Great Depression. Times were tough for Byerly, and after he graduated from high school in 1942, they got tougher. But this was by choice. In the words of a much older Byerly, "My family don't understand that I felt it was my duty to volunteer as a paratrooper for the US Army, and what went on in the war and what it was like. I tell them that if it wasn't for what we did, they would all be marching the goose step today, and the first question they ask is, what's the goose step?" It was during the completion of basic airborne infantry training that Byerly earned the nickname Jumpin' Joe. As part of their training, paratroopers had to, as you might expect, practice jumping out of planes. Many of them were worried they'd roll an ankle or snap a leg during these jumps, so they paid Jumpin' Joe a few bucks to make the jumps for them using their names. After Byerly completed his training, the army assigned him to the Screaming Eagles, aka the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division. The unit was stationed in England in the lead-up to the Allied operations in occupied France in April and May 1944. As a radio communications and demolition specialist, Byerly participated in at least 2 clandestine missions whose objectives were to deliver gold to the French resistance. Then, on the 6th of June, Byerly's world was flipped upside down. En route to blow up some bridges behind Operation Overlord's Utah Beach, Byerly's C-47 Skytrain came under attack, and his team was forced to ditch at low altitude, far from their targeted drop zone. Despite having just 110 meters or 360 feet between him and the ground, Byerly survived the drop. And now, he was alone behind enemy lines, with no way of contacting his fellow paratroopers. Instead of freaking out, Byerly decided to blow up a power station. He then continued to blow shit up until, a few days later, the Germans captured him. Things got pretty grim for Byerly at this point. He was moved from prison to prison to prison, and in this time, 2 of his escape attempts ended in capture and reprisal. According to Byerly's daughter, Julie, Dad had a dent in his head. It was very visible. I remember putting my finger in it. When I would ask him about it, he said, "A German got mad at me." In his 3rd escape attempt, Byerly and his fellow escapees managed to get clear of the prison, only to mistakenly board a train to Berlin instead of Poland. This time, after his inevitable capture, Byerly was turned over to the Gestapo. In Byerly's words, "I'd resisted interrogation before, better than most. But under the Gestapo, I was not being interrogated, just tortured, extremely tortured, for the pleasure of the torturers." While they weren't angels, someone was looking out for Byerly, however. Learning of Byerly's predicament, some German military officials surmised that, by holding on to a military prisoner, the Gestapo was in breach of its role as a civilian police force. If Byerly was going to be locked up anywhere, it would be in a prison run by the German military. Freed from the Gestapo, Byerly was treated by the German nurses we mentioned at the start of this video, and then transferred to Stalag 3C POW camp in western Poland. And once again, he managed to escape, this time for good. It was January 1945 at this point. Byerly had been between POW camps for about 7 months, and he was, understandably, pissed off. So he decided to head east, hoping to run into the Red Army and rejoin the fight alongside the Soviets. Bumping into a Soviet tank battalion, he raised a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes and shouted "American comrade" in Russian, one of the few phrases he knew. And it seems that his cigarettes did indeed bring him luck. The battalion's commander, a woman named Alexandra Samosenko, took some convincing, but finally allowed the American stray to join her in her war against Germany. Byerly's son John later discussed this event in an interview, stating, "I think Dad was amazed, and frankly a lot of Russians to this day are amazed to find out that women commanded tank units at the end of the war. He was just delighted to be in friendly hands. They gave him a weapon and allowed him to ride along." Over the next 3 or so weeks, Byerly proved himself a worthy addition to the tank battalion by using his demolition skills to obliterate trees blocking the unit's advance. Under Samosenko's leadership, Byerly even helped liberate the very POW camp in which he'd previously been held. Unfortunately, Byerly was wounded during a German dive bomber attack soon after. This saw him transferred to a Soviet hospital. As if Byerly's story wasn't bizarre enough, none other than the indomitable Marshal Georgy Zhukov visited him during his recovery. Through a translator, Byerly told Zhukov his story, and Zhukov must have liked it because he organized Byerly to rejoin his American brothers in arms. When Byerly arrived at the US Embassy in Moscow in February, he learned he was, in fact, dead. Well, that's what the records said, and what everyone back home believed. They'd even held a funeral for the poor bloke and published his obituary in the Muskegon newspaper. While the embassy confirmed Byerly's identity via his fingerprints, Byerly got to chill under the watchful eye of the Marine Guard in the Metropole Hotel in the center of the Russian city. With his identity confirmed, the embassy returned Byerly to the United States in time to celebrate VE Day. And what a story he had to tell his fellow celebrants. But life goes on, and Byerly had to set the war aside and make a return to civilian life. He got married, had kids, and worked for Brunswick Corporation for 28 years. However, he didn't seek to wholly forget his time in Europe. 20 years after he leapt from that smoking C-47 on D-Day, he returned to Normandy to reflect on his experience alongside some other American veterans. One such veteran, Donald R. Burgett, had the following to say: "I didn't know Byerly very well, but I sure knew he could shoot and was one hell of a guy. It's good for us to remember the sacrifices that were made by men like him in liberating France." On D-Day's 50th anniversary in 1994, US President Bill Clinton and Russian President Boris Yeltsin awarded Byerly service medals for his bravery in the war. He was a hero in the eyes of the Americans and Russians both. According to Byerly's son, "My father's great fear was the slow slide into oblivion, a nursing home or worse. He always said, 'When I go, I want to drop and skid along the ground.'" And while Byerly didn't get to leave this world in such a drastic fashion as that, he at least avoided the nursing home. During a visit to Georgia, where he'd trained as a paratrooper and earned the nickname Jumpin' Joe back in 1942, he died in his sleep. A journey of thousands of miles around the forbidding bulge of West Africa, up the Atlantic coast of Portugal, across the Bay of Biscay, headed for the Channel, for the North Sea, and then for England, Lincolnshire, and home. This is enough to fill even the most stout-hearted of us with terror, but for Major Jim Almonds, setting sail from Ghana on a self-built craft, it was the culmination of a long-held dream. A dream that had refused to die. Even the boat upon which Major Almonds sailed was the product of a dream. Taken prisoner at Benghazi, Libya in 1942, the SAS soldier endured months of brutal treatment at the hands of Italian captors before being shipped across the Mediterranean to Europe and to Italy. In 1943, after escape and recapture, Major Almonds found himself locked in a room the size of a toilet. After assaulting an officer during his attempt at liberty, he was placed in solitary confinement, awaiting a death sentence. In a battle to keep his body fit and his mind sharp, he did daily push-ups, sketched his thoughts in diary entries on the wall, and designed a seagoing craft in his head. Now, as his fully realized vision of a craft pulled away from the Ghanaian coast, Major Almonds felt the sea breeze upon his face and understood the perils that lay ahead of him. But far, far more important than this, he understood that he was going home. Jim Almonds' story is an exceptional one, but it's not wholly unique. Stories of Allied prisoners of war in Germany or in Japanese camps in Southeast Asia are well told and have been the subject of countless books, movies, and TV shows over the years. But for the many thousands of POWs held in Italian camps, often brutalized by their guards, their stories are almost forgotten. Few people have lived lives like that of Jim Almonds, but many would have experienced the horror of the Italian camps in just the same way he did. In this video, we're going to be shining a light on these experiences and understand just why Allied soldiers dreaded Italian POW camps during World War II. At least 75,000 Allied prisoners of war were held in a network of camps that spanned the length and breadth of Italy. From the Piedmont in the northwest to the Yugoslav border in the east, and as far south as Brindisi in the heel of Italy's boot and Castelvetrano on the island of Sicily, Allied soldiers passed through a complex system of detention. This system included dozens of prisoner of war facilities, as well as military hospitals, transit camps, and work camps. These locations existed alongside the CC, or concentration camps, designed for Italy's civilian population. CCs also served as fascist Italy's contribution to the Nazis' Holocaust. In some cases, the infrastructure was already in place. The savage fighting along Italy's Alpine front during World War I made POW camps a necessity. Campo 78 at Sulmona had seen the detention of Austrian prisoners from Isonzo and Trentino during the First World War, and was reopened some 2 decades later to process up to 3,000 British and Commonwealth officers. South African author Ice Clear would write about his experiences at Sulmona in his 1946 book, The Way Out. Clear escaped from the camp after his Italian guards deserted in 1943, slipping away into the hills with hundreds of his fellow prisoners before German forces could take control of the situation. A map recovered from a war diary kept by the Italian Royal Army's General Staff outlines segregated camps for French, English, Greeks, Yugoslavs, and Russians. But we know that camps were often segregated even further. Acquafredda and Vercelli, for example, were predominantly for Australian and New Zealander troops, while Grumello del Piano mainly held Cypriot and Indian troops. Others were barely segregated at all, like Servigliano, which was home to soldiers from France, Cyprus, the US, Yugoslavia, Malta, and Greece, among other far-flung locations. It was in this complex network of military detention that soldiers like Jim Almonds, along with thousands of others, were swallowed. Some would escape, but more would serve out their time under the watchful gaze of their captors until Italy fell to the Allies. A huge number would suffer extreme treatment along the way, and many would not survive to see the end of the war in Europe. The fact that inmates worked so hard to escape from prison camps, often putting their own lives in grave danger, doesn't really tell us much. While the war still raged, many soldiers, particularly SAS men like Jim Almonds, felt a strong sense of duty. They wanted, or even needed, to escape and to keep fighting to serve the war effort. These POWs could have been sleeping on feather beds and receiving 4-course meals at dinner time, and there would still have been escape attempts. In most cases though, prisoners of war were not sleeping on feather beds and were not being generously fed. Records from Italian camps shows us that the situation was dire, with prisoners subjected to wretched treatment and forced to endure pitiful conditions. Italian POW camps were frequently overcrowded, with inadequate food, water, and medical supplies spread across thousands of inmates. There was also a lack of infrastructure. Some camps may have been left over from the First World War, but this doesn't mean they were ready to handle the massive influx of prisoners from campaigns in Africa and across Europe. Sanitation and shelter were sorely lacking. Despite the fascist obsession with discipline and rigid social structure, camps were often disorganized and poorly run. The result of this was chaos and violence on a serious scale. Neglect was also an issue. The Italian government was simply not that bothered about the welfare of the soldiers they captured in the field. As camps sprung up and filled across the country, they needed vast amounts of resources and support. Resources and support that simply did not come. And then there was the brutality. Physical violence, forced labor, and abuse in many different forms were often deployed to control and intimidate prisoners, although it should be noted it was mainly the hardline Italian fascists perpetrating these acts. The story of Major Almonds gives us a glimpse of what was going on behind the barbed wire in the sentry posts, but there are many other stories and many other instances of abuse just like this one. Let's explore it in a bit more detail. After the static slaughter of the Eastern and Western fronts in World War I, the Second World War was an enormous departure. The slaughter was still there, and so was the misery, but the rigid battle lines gave way to a far more mobile brand of warfare. The German Blitzkrieg is the most famous example, but Montgomery's push westwards from Egypt after El Alamein and the American island hopping surge through the Pacific in the final year of the war show us just how critical movement and strategy had become in modern combat. This movement and strategy meant sweeping victories for some and catastrophic defeats for others. The arrival of Rommel in North Africa in 1941 is something we've spoken about before on this channel, but the dogged efficiency with which he ran his units was a crucial factor in reversing Allied gains and driving British and Commonwealth forces back east, isolating the 33,000-man garrison at Tobruk. When Tobruk fell on June 21st, 1942, the influx of prisoners into Axis camps was immense. One of these camps was PG-54, Passo Correse Fara in Sabina, some 22 miles from Rome. Around 4,000 prisoners were placed here into 2 compounds of tents. Men were held here in abject conditions, as the camp simply could not cope. PG-54 was eventually reorganized as a transit camp after the Italian armistice in September 1943, but the inmates would endure many months of overcrowding and subhuman treatment before they were evacuated. As a grim twist to the tale, a German train evacuating prisoners from PG-54 on January 28, 1944, was struck by Allied bombers while crossing the Orvieto Bridge in Umbria. Around half of the 1,100 prisoners either perished in their burning railroad cars or fell to their deaths in the river below. The tents of Passo Correse, with their poor sanitation and inadequate shelter, were far from a unique feature in the camp network. POWs across the country were forced to battle brutal summer temperatures and withering winters with only a thin sheet of canvas to protect them. And then we've got PG-12, a camp near Florence. While only a handful of prisoners were held here, the crumbling structure of the 13th century castle provided little comfort for the inmates. Up and down Italy, buildings were hastily repurposed into makeshift prisons. PG-21, Chieti, had been a convent. PG-49 at Fontanalato near Parma, an orphanage. The secure hospitals of Bergamo, Lucca and Altamura had been almshouses, monasteries and schools respectively. While these buildings might have offered some protection against the elements, they were often woefully under-resourced, and the swift conversion of civilian infrastructure into military prisons frequently left much to be desired. Of course, it was the prisoners who would pay the price. The Italian military is often portrayed as one of the great failures of the Second World War. This is almost certainly grossly unfair. Italian units fought with valor and dignity in European and African theaters throughout the war, and almost 320,000 Italian soldiers gave up their lives in battle. What is true, however, is that Italy was not the staunch ally that Nazi Germany hoped it would be. Time and time again, Italy's naval, air and land forces did not secure their objectives, essentially having to be bailed out by German units. This happened in Greece in 1940, when invading Italian battalions were driven out of the country, leaving the Axis oil infrastructure in Romania dangerously exposed. Eventually, it would be the Germans that overran and occupied Greece. This also happened in North Africa, where the Italians were almost destroyed before Rommel and his desert units arrived. Poorly led and seriously ill-equipped, the Italians just could not muster the same devastating power as the Germans. The Italian military was overstretched and repeatedly outclassed, while back at home, this same military also had to oversee its prison camps. This led to a breakdown in command that meant chaos and violence in the camps themselves, as guards and commanders became unaccountable to those higher up the chain. When North Africa finally fell in 1943 and the invasion of mainland Italy began, the fleeing Italian guards basically left prisoners to fend for themselves until German units could reach the abandoned camps. Neglect of prisoners was already a significant issue even before Allied troops landed in Italy. In 1932, the future dictator outlined his vision for the fascist future of Italy, how Italians should live, how Italians should govern, and how Italians should sacrifice all for their nation. And, crucially, how Italians should fight. Fascism carries this anti-pacifistic attitude into the life of the individual, Mussolini wrote. "I don't care a damn," the proud motto of the fighting squad scrawled by a wounded man onto his bandages. This is evidence of a fighting spirit that accepts all risks. This was not a regime of compassion, not even for its own people. For its enemies, the outlook was even bleaker. Why should the Italians divert valuable time, resources, and money in looking after those who had taken up arms against them, those who had killed their brothers and compatriots? For Mussolini's government and for the military who supported them, the answer was simple: they shouldn't. And so prisoners were left to suffer in their camps or work to death in fields and factories. Jack Byrne was an impressive soldier. His actions in France and then in North Africa caught the attention of Captain David Sterling, who was putting together a new outfit that would change the way wars were fought forever. L Detachment, 1st Special Service Brigade, consisted of only elite troops, brave, resourceful, and incredibly well trained. This unit would become the 1st SAS regiment, and Jack Byrne would be one of its original members. March 15th, 1942, and Byrne is already a veteran of numerous SAS raids behind enemy lines. Tonight, Byrne is in a 4-man team commanded by the legendary Blair Paddy Mayne. Their target? The Berka airfield to the south of Benghazi. Just after midnight, the team begins laying their charges, targeting anti-aircraft guns, petrol dumps, and then a line of Axis planes that sat unattended on the airfield. In the chaos that followed, Byrne found himself alone. With bombs detonating in the airfield descending into panic, Byrne struck out for the second rendezvous point, convinced he was too late to make the first. It was a miscalculation, and Byrne was faced with a 200-mile solo trek back to the Allied lines across the burning desert. 5 days later, and 70 miles from safety, he was picked up by a German patrol. The German officer stopped about 3 feet away, his pistol within inches of my face. As I yanked my revolver from its holster and flung it on the ground, the German drew back his pistol, then fired it point blank into my face. I fell, half stunned, face down in the sand, blood spurting from my nose and temple. Miraculously, Byrne survived what should have been certain death from an exceptionally jumpy officer, but his torment was far from over. Italian officers, delighted at the capture of one of the ghosts of the night who blew up their airfields and sowed havoc behind their lines, were out for revenge. The wounded Byrne was beaten savagely and repeatedly by the Italians, who were in no mood for mercy. Byrne would eventually be detained in Germany before escaping to Sweden and returning to Britain in the bomb hold of a Mosquito aircraft. As Allied troops returned to France in 1944, Byrne would be with them, back to finish the war that had already taken so much from him. Decorated and celebrated after his wartime actions, Jack Byrne passed away in 2007, aged 85. War crimes, abuses of power, horrific acts of brutality. This was a grim reality for all armies in the Second World War, both on the Axis and the Allied side. However, spurred on by the fiery rhetoric of a text like Mussolini's Doctrine of Fascism, the methods of the hardline Italian forces rank among the most chilling. Giovanni Ravelli was a respected policeman in post-war Italy, noted for his dogged pursuit of criminals and for his love of gardening and peace and quiet during a well-earned retirement. Few who knew Ravelli could believe that this was the same man who used pliers to rip the teeth from the head of Greek police officer Isaac Sinanoglu in 1941. At Ravelli's hands, Sinanoglu was dragged behind a horse and then tortured to death over several agonizing days. Ravelli's wartime escapades included raping prisoners and ordering his men to pour boiling oil over their captors. Surely this could not be the same Ravelli who served as an advisor to the Prime Minister, or who caught the thieves who stole a Caravaggio painting from Palermo Church in 1969. And yet, it was. From Greece to Yugoslavia, from Libya to Ethiopia, the reports of Italian war crimes are startling. General Rodolfo Graziani massacred entire communities in Italy's African colonies, while the soldiers serving under General Mario Ruata in the Balkans nicknamed him the Black Beast after repeated atrocities. One of Ruata's soldiers wrote, "We have destroyed everything from top to bottom without sparing the innocent. We kill entire families every night, beating them to death or shooting them." The civilian death toll at the hands of Ruata's units is believed to be in the tens of thousands. In Montenegro, the troops of General Alessandro Pergio Biroli murdered dozens of civilians and partisan prisoners in the Plevia massacre. In Croatia, around 100 civilians were massacred at Podhum. The Italian occupation of Albania resulted in 28,000 dead, while at least 3,500 bodies were recovered from the Rub concentration camp in Dalmatia, just one of the countless similar camps across Italy's territory. World War II was a conflict marked by human suffering, from the Bataan Death March to starvation at Leningrad, and from the concentration camps of Eastern Europe to the POW camps of the Axis powers. The Italian forces of World War II fought across Europe and North Africa and encountered prisoners from many nations. However, the Italian government was simply not up to the task of treating them with dignity. While this same can be said of many nations throughout the conflict, the question at the heart of today's video is, why were Italian prisoner of war camps so feared by Allied soldiers? The answer, as is so often the case within war, is complex and defies a simple explanation. The Italian infrastructure was not prepared for the influx of so many prisoners, leading to makeshift and haphazard accommodations, some going so far back as the Great War. The lack of strong leadership meant that mistreatment ran rampant across some camps, but was tightly controlled in others, and as the Italian war effort collapsed, confusion and neglect reigned supreme around the camps. After months at sea, Major Jim Almans made it home. He would live to see his beloved Lincolnshire again, he would see his family, and he would grow old with stories to tell. Jack Byrne, with his own daring tales of escape, fortitude and cunning, would achieve the same, living to old age, but never quite shaking the horrors he'd experienced as one of the original SAS soldiers. Isaac Sinanoglu would not be so lucky, nor would hundreds of men who perished on the Orvieto Bridge in 1944, left for dead by their fleeing guards. All fell victim to the great scourge of POW camp deaths during World War II. But what do you think? What were the root causes behind the failure of Italy's prisoner of war camps? When we think of the Germans in World War II, the default thought is usually that of the merciless Gestapo and SS agents who terrorized their enemies. But that doesn't represent the whole truth. Some of the German regulars, those who weren't part of the Gestapo or SS, weren't all that bad. In his book, SAS Great Escapes, author Damian Lewis highlights that fact by sharing the story of how a German doctor and a major worked together to save the life of an English prisoner of war whom the Gestapo wanted dead. This is the miraculous story of Quinton Hughes. On January 12, 1944, 6 British Special Air Service members, 2 officers and 4 paratroopers jumped from a C-47 Dakota under the cover of darkness down to the Italian countryside. They were carrying out Operation Pomegranate, an Allied effort to attack German aircraft stored at the Italian airfield of Sant'Egidio, about 100 miles north of Rome. From the beginning, the operation had major troubles. Just after the paratroopers jumped safely from their aircraft, the plane crashed into the side of a nearby mountain, killing everybody on board. On the ground, the paratroopers faced their own difficulties from the moment they landed. Though they were in the countryside, the land was crawling with enemies and they could only move at night across the most difficult terrain in order to avoid detection. Their packs weighed them down with detonators, fuses and explosives along with their rations and guns. One of the members of the group later recalled that the going was very difficult. The group hiked around the western shore of Lake Trasimeno and spent 2 days climbing more than 3,000 feet over Mount Tetsuo. Then went east toward River Tiber, which British intelligence had assured them would be crossable that time of the year. However, recent heavy rain and runoff from the mountains had flooded the river, making it impossible to wade across, which had been their original plan. They followed the flow of the river down until they came across a wire suspended above the water, which led them to a small hut where they found a very sketchy looking hand-operated cable car. With no other options, the men crossed the river 2 by 2, somehow managing to avoid detection. Or, at least, that's what they thought at the time. As they walked away, they heard a German voice shouting into the night, ordering them to stop and to identify themselves. The group immediately scattered, finding cover wherever they could. One of the officers and the focus of our story, Lieutenant Quinton Hughes, tried to determine the size of the force they were facing from his hiding spot between 2 buildings, but had nothing to go off. After several minutes of waiting, Hughes, along with the only other person in the alley with him, Troop Commander Major Anthony Widrington, decided it must have been a lone German soldier who had spotted them and didn't fancy his odds against a group of enemy soldiers. They were able to navigate their way through a series of farm buildings to retrace their steps and deliver themselves to the relative safety of the untouched land on the other side. But now they had to face the next challenge, which was finding the rest of their team. Hughes used his SAS training to imitate the calls of nocturnal birds to try and call out to them, but was again met with silence. Hughes and Widrington began to search the surrounding area, but after 45 minutes and no leads, they had no choice but to give up. With only 1/3 of their original group still in action, Hughes and Widrington had a difficult decision to make. 1. Abandon the mission and head toward Allied territory in the south. 2. Go forth with the operation, just the two of them. Operation Pomegranate was a support mission for the larger Operation Shingle, whose objective was to break through German lines and take Rome for the Allies. It was an important operation that the Allies hoped would lead to a total German withdrawal from Italy. The airfield that Operation Pomegranate was set to attack contained planes that were the most likely to spot Operation Shingle's fleet sailing toward Italy during reconnaissance flights. As Hughes put it, their job was to put out the eyes of the Germans. Without those planes, the Germans would have no hope of spotting the incoming fleet until it was too late. For that very reason, Hughes and Widrington decided to push on. They moved at night and rested during the day, but the going was so difficult that the men had to rely on benzodrine and amphetamine to help keep them from buckling under the immense exhaustion. As the sun set on January 17th, they arrived at the airbase, just 4 days before the scheduled start of Operation Shingle. With the rapid loss of light, the men couldn't make out the exact positions of the aircraft, and all the time they had spent poring over the details and layouts of the field proved to be somewhat useless to them as they struggled to get their bearings. However, by a stroke of pure chance and luck, 4 Ju-88s landed on the runway, one of them crashing and catching fire. The blaze illuminated the airfield enough that Hughes and Widrington were able to make out the perimeter of the field. Now armed with the intel they needed to carry out their mission, the men hid themselves and rested up, planning to strike the following day. They each had 12 Lewis bombs, lightweight explosives designed specifically for the SAS with the ability to burn for a longer duration. When the time finally came, they snuck onto the airfield and began placing the explosives onto different aircraft. They made sure the bombs were all primed to blow at the same time, so as not to give the Germans any time to disarm them once the first one went off. After they both finished putting the bombs on their targets, the two men retreated and began the work of defusing the remaining bombs they had in their possession. In order to make sure all the bombs exploded at the same time, they had to pull the fuses all at once. But due to the chilly air of central Italy in January, the fuses took more time to burn, giving the men a grace period of about 2 hours to lay them all out. Hughes and Widrington had no idea how long it had taken them to place the explosives on the planes, so they had to work quickly to defuse the remaining ones. But just as Hughes finished defusing the final bomb, he looked over at Widrington just in time to see his commanding officer be consumed by flames as one of his explosives detonated. The force of the explosion was strong enough that Hughes was blown into the air. Somehow, he managed to stand up, but his eyes weren't working correctly. When he tried to touch them, all he could feel was pulp. I was blinded and near completely deaf. He tried to find Widrington by crawling on his hands and knees and patting the ground around him. He eventually found his commander after faintly making out Widrington's moans. Though Hughes couldn't see him, he knew it was dire, as he could smell Widrington's burnt flesh. The explosion had blown off the commander's hands, along with a massive chunk of his abdomen. Hughes, shocked that Widrington was still alive, gathered him in his arms. As he did so, the bombs they had placed around the airfield detonated. Miraculously, despite all odds, their mission was successful. At that point, their most pressing matter was finding help, because, without it, both men were sure to die. Hughes knew that escape with his injuries was nigh impossible, let alone Widrington's. There was really only one way either of them had a chance of survival, and that was capture. So Hughes raised his Colt 45 pistol above his head and fired every last bullet into the air to get the Germans' attention. He then quickly managed to burn all the incriminating documents he and Widrington had been carrying to eliminate any hard evidence of the sabotage before falling into unconsciousness. When Hughes finally came to, he found himself in a German hospital in Perugia, Italy. Unfortunately, he was there alone, as Widrington had succumbed to his injuries shortly after being discovered by the Germans. The Gestapo were eager to interrogate Hughes, but with his hearing still severely damaged and his eyes bandaged, he was of little use to them. He could hear his doctor arguing with them loudly in German by his bed, insisting that his patient was in no condition to be answering any of their questions and that they would have to wait for Hughes to recover. The Gestapo reluctantly agreed, but ordered that Hughes be kept away from all other Allied patients, so he was moved to a ward reserved for German officers. There, he felt isolated, unable to talk with anyone, and he began to descend into a dark place. The only solace he found was with his German physician, Dr. Hans-Gunga Sonkerat, who would sit by Hughes's bed at the end of every shift and just chat with him, and the men bonded. Hughes recalled, "We talked of fishing, walking, and playing in the woods." As the camaraderie and trust between the men grew, Hughes offered his parole to Sonkerat. Offering parole means that Hughes would not attempt to escape so long as he was under the doctor's charge. In exchange, Sonkerat promised that he would do anything he could to save Hughes's sight. He even called in a specialist eye surgeon to take a look at Hughes's eyes. They learned that saving his sight was not a lost cause, and through time and treatment, Hughes gradually regained his vision in one eye and was delighted when he was able to see his new friend for the first time. To celebrate his patient's restored vision, Sonkerat bought Hughes a book on architecture. During one of their many chats, Hughes had expressed his desire to return to his native Liverpool after the end of the war to study architecture and help rebuild what had been destroyed. But Sonkerat knew that the Gestapo had no intention of letting Hughes live to see the end of the war. With Hughes's condition improving, it was becoming more and more difficult for the doctor to stave off the Gestapo. Eventually, one member of the Gestapo got through and sat at Hughes's bedside. His only job was to get as much information about the SAS out of Hughes as possible, but under the Geneva Convention, Hughes was only required to give his name, rank, and serial number to the officer. But those rules only applied to prisoners of war being held by their enemy, and as the Gestapo officer informed Hughes, he was not being considered a prisoner of war. The Führer himself had issued a commando order stating that any and all saboteurs captured by the Germans would be executed. The best Hughes could hope for out of this situation was clemency, and in order to get it, he had to answer all of the officers' questions truthfully. Hughes was shocked and didn't know if what the Gestapo said about the commando order was true, with the confusion stemming from the fact that Hitler had secretly issued the order in October of 1942. At that point, Hughes had no choice but to assume it was true and start talking. However, he had to be smart. He needed to strike a very delicate balance between giving the Gestapo information they thought they wanted and not telling them anything that could be used against the SAS. He started telling them exactly where he and Widrington had stashed their supplies. He also talked about the 2 years he'd spent in Malta, during which time the SAS had been protecting supply lines in the Mediterranean from enemy attacks. Though Hughes didn't directly work for the SAS at the time, he worked alongside them. In fact, Operation Pomegranate was his first with the SAS. But since the Maltese campaign had since ended, he felt confident that his information wouldn't compromise his brothers in the SAS. The Gestapo officer was satisfied with Hughes's information, and as he left his bedside, he informed Hughes that once he made a full recovery, the Gestapo were still going to shoot him. Hughes didn't let the news of his impending execution dampen his spirits too much. Quite the opposite, in fact. He continued to hang out with Sonkerat and also made another friend, another of the doctor's patients, Major Gerhard Schacht, an officer of the Fallschirmjäger, the German equivalent to the British Parachute Regiment. The two men bonded over their shared experience as paratroopers after Schacht introduced himself, interested in meeting the Englishman who had sabotaged the Sant Egidio airfield. Hughes called the Major very friendly and pleasant, even though they were sworn enemies. But it didn't seem to bother Hughes, Schacht, or the doctor, who actually ended up introducing Hughes to the rest of the German officers on the ward. Hughes said that though the war had to be fought, there was no hate between us. After a time, they even began to have parties. The men listened to British and German radio. They danced, sang, and talked like friends. Hughes described the parties as rambunctious affairs, but it wasn't all fun for him. The parties were held in Dr. Sonntgerhardt's office, where a detailed map of Italy hung on the far wall. Though Hughes planned to keep his word to the doctor and had no plans to escape while under his care, he knew that eventually he would be in someone else's ward before the Gestapo shot him, and he planned to use that time to escape. He studied the map when he could without making it too obvious. Though the German officers were friendly with him, there was still a war going on, and they fought on opposite sides. His survival depended on him seeming like a harmless patient with no intention of running. But how could he not have the intention of running? After all, he was being nursed back to health just to ultimately be killed, a pig being raised for the slaughter. After some time, Major Schacht recovered from his injuries and returned to the field, going to work for the German commander-in-chief in Italy. Not long after his departure, Schacht invited Hughes and the doctor to dinner. There, Schacht asked Hughes to desert the Allies and join the Axis forces. Since Hughes was an elite service member, his expertise would have naturally been extremely useful to the German cause. In addition, Schacht promised that Hughes would not be asked to fight against the British or any Western power, but instead fight the Soviets. Hughes actually considered the proposition for a moment, if for no other reason to continue to spend time with his new German friends. But truthfully, he knew that he didn't have it in him to join the Axis side. He told Schacht that he was honored by the officer and that he would consider it, but it was somewhat useless given that the Gestapo wanted him dead. And he had a point. Not long after the dinner, Dr. Sonntgerhardt informed Hughes that the Gestapo wanted to take him into their custody within the next few days. Hughes fell into a deep depression, knowing what his fate in the hands of the Gestapo would be, and knowing that his family would never have the full story of what happened to him, how he had made the best of a bad situation, and even forged friendships in the most unlikely of circumstances. However, it would be those friendships that would ultimately save Hughes's life. Sonntgerhardt and Schacht couldn't bear to see their English friend executed. They knew they could save him if they had his status changed from illegal saboteur to prisoner of war, but neither of them held that kind of power. In fact, the only man who did was Field Marshal Kesselring. And it just so happened that the Kesselrings and the Schachts were old family friends. Just days before Hughes was scheduled to be handed over to the Gestapo, Schacht traveled 100 miles to Florence, where Kesselring was headquartered. There, Schacht pleaded Hughes's case personally. On the day Hughes was scheduled to be turned over to the Gestapo, he was oddly calm, having finally accepted his fate. But the Gestapo never came. Instead, it was Dr. Sonntgerhardt who entered Hughes's room with the news that Schacht had done what they had thought impossible, changed Hughes's classification to prisoner of war. They had very little time to celebrate though. The Gestapo were furious and certainly going to do everything in their power to get the change overturned so they could execute Hughes. They had to move quickly. Schacht and Sonntgerhardt had already arranged for Hughes to be taken to a Luftwaffe camp in Germany to keep him out of the POW collecting center in Verona, where the Gestapo were most definitely going to be looking for him. As Hughes and the doctor said their final goodbyes, Hughes asked if he could withdraw his parole, essentially asking permission to make an escape. Sonntgerhardt agreed, emotional, and wished his English friend good luck. As Hughes sat on the train taking him to a POW camp in Florence, he thought about his new friends. They had risked being court-martialed or worse by helping him. Without them, he would have been murdered by the Gestapo, his life tossed away like it was nothing. Hughes said many Germans committed the most appalling atrocities. Some were capable of great humanity and decency toward their foes. Because of the actions of the doctor and the major, Hughes was able to escape from the clutches of the Germans, taking him on a journey that saw him jumping out of a moving train, trekking through the Apennine Mountains, teaming up with members of the Italian resistance, befriending British army officers, and sailing a rickety old boat in the open sea to Allied territory. Hughes' ultimate survival in the war was nothing short of a miracle that would not have been possible without his German friends. After the war, Hughes returned to Liverpool, where he became the architect he had dreamed of being. He looked up his old friends to see what had become of them after the war. Unfortunately, Dr. Sontgerat had been executed after trying to organize a group to surrender to the Allies. Schacht, on the other hand, did survive the war and enjoyed a long career in the post-war German army. It's unclear if Hughes ever reached out to Schacht, but it's hard to imagine that the two men would ever have forgotten their special friendship.